One myth to rule them all. One myth to find them. One myth to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Oh wait, this is supposed to be a good thing? I guess we should do another take. New times need new stories, new heroes, new virtues, tied to our mythic past but looking always ahead towards the next turn of the weird. These are the gods and heroes of the modern age. This is the new mythology. Okay, stop me if you've heard this one. So, there's this guy, and it's definitely a guy, who's living a simple life in a simple home, but yearning to be more, to do more. Then one day, this guy, and it's definitely a guy, is presented with a problem or a challenge that is also the opportunity he's been waiting for to be more, to do more. But he turns it down because reasons. Maybe he has too many family obligations or something. After this, he meets a wise old sage or some other kind of mentor who comes bearing gifts, and together they take up the call to adventure. They move through a strange world full of mysterious creatures or people, some of whom will help our guy, and it's definitely a guy, and others of whom will oppose him. While on this path, our guy enters a dark place where the goal of his quest, be it a person or an object, is hidden. But before our guy can escape with his prize, he first has to face death, either literally or symbolically. He escapes death, but he's not out of the woods yet, for vengeful forces pursue him and he flees with his prize. Finally, he comes out of the other side of all these trials and foes, a changed person. A new person with gifts and wisdom to share back at the place he started. Of course, you've heard this one before. It's Star Wars. It's the plot of Star Wars. And the other Star Wars. And the other Star Wars. And The Lion King. We'll come back to this one. And The Matrix. And Fight Club. And Harry Potter. And Men in Black. And, well, you get the point. It's the story structure of a huge amount of Hollywood cinema across multiple genres and multiple decades. If you pay close attention to all of these different stories, you might start to think that they're all just variations on a theme, different iterations of the same story, the one myth to rule them all, getting constantly retold. It's all the same. And you wouldn't be wrong. A significant amount of Hollywood content is, in fact, built on this collection of story beats, this modular narrative chassis that streamlines the process of filmmaking by giving screenwriters, directors, and producers a template to follow. If you ask most people in the industry why it's done this way, they would tell you they're following a template that's popularly known as the hero's journey, and that they are following it because it's the universal template, the one myth to rule them all, that all humans everywhere have been telling and retelling since the first tellings around Paleolithic fires. The story goes that all the great stories that humans have ever told are all, fundamentally, following the same pattern, a pattern rooted in our innate human nature and our innate human psyche, and therefore present in every human culture in every time period. And the logical implication is thus that Hollywood cinema can't help but structure their stories this way. It is, after all, the only valid way to structure stories. And attempts to deviate from it, real or perceived, are thus fool's errands, doomed to fail. But every great story has a good twist, and here's the plot twist for this one. None of that is true.
It's all bullshit.
The hero's journey is not a universal story structure. It's not even a particularly old story structure. and the way it's lionized by both major studios and small fry content creators leads way too many of us, and way too many of them, into a flattening of narrative possibilities that has harmed discourse and enabled a lot of bigotry, intentional or otherwise. So in this episode of The New Mythology, we'll be looking at one of the biggest new myths in our culture. Not a myth that's become a story, but a myth we tell ourselves about stories. A myth called the hero's journey.
We don't need another hero. We don't need another way home.
Every good story has a beginning, and contrary to what you may have heard, the story of the hero's journey begins not in ancient times, but in 1949. That's when Joseph Campbell published his now famous book of comparative mythology, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I realize that for a lot of people, 1949 is ancient times, but I think you know what I mean. The thesis of Campbell's book was that all human heroic tales are variations on a single myth, a one myth to rule them all, that more or less follows the outline we started this video with. There are some praiseworthy things about this thesis. For example, it emphasized the siblinghood of all humans at a time when humanity was emerging from one of its most destructive and murderously divisive periods. The hero's journey also has some pretty insidious assumptions baked into it, and we'll get to those a bit later. First, we'll note that Campbell's book languished in obscurity for several decades. It didn't become a bestseller, and the hero's journey didn't become the default Hollywood story template until the 1980s, when a hotshot young creative executive named Christopher Vogler circulated a memo about the hero's journey in the offices of Walt Disney Pictures. By his own account, Vogler had been drawn to Campbell's book in film school after watching the original Star Wars, which was at that time still just called Star Wars, and its two sequels. Star Wars, of course, had been a surprise blockbuster, wildly beyond anyone's expectations, and studios had been scrambling to discover the keys to its success so they could replicate it. Vogler had noticed that George Lucas cited Campbell's book as one of his key influences, and upon reading the book, he noticed that the Star Wars films hewed closely to Campbell's hypothesized universal story template, almost exactly beat for beat, in fact. Thus, Vogler became convinced of Campbell's thesis and was sure it was the key that his bosses at Disney could use to replicate Star Wars' success. So, in 1985, Vogler penned a 7-page treatment of the hero's journey as a memo and sent it up the chain at the Disney offices.
I gave copies of the memo to my story analyst friends and to key Disney executives. Interesting was all that most people said at first, but I sensed somehow I was onto something. I had the vision that copies of the memo were like little robots moving out from the studio and into the jet stream of Hollywood thinking all on their own. Fax machines had just been invented, and I envisioned copies of the memo flying all over town, and that's exactly what happened. Feedback started coming in that suggested I had hit a nerve. I heard young executives buzzing about it, telling their friends about it. It became the I have to have it document of the season at talent agencies and in studio executive suites.
Vogler's memo went viral before going viral was what we called going viral. Facilitated by new technology, his endorsement and promotion of Campbell's hero's journey blazed through Hollywood culture in a matter of weeks, and before long, it became the default template applied to nearly every new project. Vogler was promoted for his work and given a story consultant position on The Lion King, a movie that follows the hero's journey even more closely than Star Wars, arguably closer than any other movie ever made. And it quickly became a textbook example of how to structure a story using the hero's journey. Vogler went on to publish a book of screenwriting advice in 1992 titled The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers, and in its wake, the hero's journey now appears as standard writing advice in every book on screenwriting, every screenwriting class and workshop, and in almost every grade school and high school level English class in the US, and maybe the entire English-speaking world for all I know. Standard American education on screenwriting is now pretty much built around the mantra of 3-act structure, hero's journey, 3-act structure, hero's journey, 3-act structure, hero's journey. And there's nothing inherently wrong with the use of this structure in and of itself. The hero's journey is a useful tool for building conflict-driven narratives centered around a single protagonist, and has led to the creation of many stories that resonate with many people. It's a valid tool in the toolbox, but it's important not to misunderstand what actually happened here. The hero's journey did not become standard operating procedure in Hollywood because it taps into universal narrative principles that reflect intrinsic human nature. It went viral before going viral was a thing because film studios are capitalist enterprises looking for a quick and easy template that would allow them to streamline film production with the least amount of financial and creative investment. And the state of affairs went from one where some American movies corresponded to some elements of the hero's journey sometimes, if you squinted enough to convince yourself it was there, to one where, for decades, almost every film produced in the Hollywood studio system conformed rigidly to this story structure, especially in genre projects. Writers and filmmakers who grew up under this paradigm were taught via English and creative writing curricula that the hero's journey wasn't just one tool in the box, but that it was the foundation of all storytelling across all human culture and all of history. And the net result of all of this is formulaic storytelling, or slop, as I've been told the kids like to say these days. Sometimes the formula is executed brilliantly, as in the cases of films like Star Wars, and the other Star Wars, and the other Star Wars, and The Matrix, and, well, take your pick. There are really a lot of examples. Most of the time, the formula is only applied competently, workmanlike, as the run of mid-budget genre films with something to say, theatrically popular through the 90s and early aughts, and now dominating the streaming services, all demonstrate. And other times, it's done poorly, as in pretty much any fiction I ever tried to write. The point is that whether or not the hero's journey resonates with an audience has more to do with the talent of the storytellers than it does with the template itself. The template is just a tool. And like any tool, it has limited applications. As long as the tool is used properly, it can be effective. But we must never fall into the trap of thinking that every challenge is a nail just because our favorite tool is a hammer. And with the rise of streaming services and their need for non-stop entertainment content, the risk of everything becoming formulaic slop is only increased by constraining our imaginations to only one template, especially if we're going to train AI on that template, God's help us. So it's a good thing we're not actually stuck with the hero's journey. You'd be hard-pressed to find a story written before Campbell's hero's journey became popular that fully conforms to his template. And the farther back you go, the harder it gets, even if you're digging into only the Western canon. There are many great ancient stories about heroes that don't fit Campbell's template at all, unless you torture them until they confess. So, let's be good little heroes and go on a journey back to the beginning and see if it might hold the key to a new future.
We don't need another hero. We don't need to know the way home.
Quick, without thinking, tell me, who is the hero of the Iliad? Did you say Achilles? You probably said Achilles. But he spends most of the tale sulking in his tent and literally crying like a schoolboy because Agamemnon stole his sex slave. The poem opens with the Achaean army suffering a plague sent by Apollo as punishment for Agamemnon stealing someone else's sex slave before all this. Achilles tells Agamemnon that he should return that slave, Chryseis, to end the plague, which the king agrees to do, but only after stealing the aforementioned sex slave of Achilles. This leads Achilles to declare that he will no longer fight for Agamemnon, so the demigod retreats to his tent and proceeds with the cope and seethe cryfest mentioned above. And this is the event that sets the rest of the epic events of the Iliad into motion. Does it sound to you anything like Campbell's call to adventure? Achilles doesn't even come out to fight until book 16, 15 whole books after he went into his tent to sulk. He only comes out to fight because his BFF Patroclus gets killed by Hector, who mistook him for Achilles after Patroclus went into battle wearing Achilles' armor. Before this, there are no steps along Campbell's hero's path for Achilles. Remember, he's been brooding in his tent for 15 whole books. Agamemnon even tried to lure him out in book 9 by offering him a bunch of sex slaves from the Isle of Lesbos, but that didn't work because Achilles was still too all up in his feelings to care about anything except his wounded pride. And then when he finally kills Hector in book 22, Achilles immediately goes hog wild in mutilating Hector's corpse, turning into kind of a rage monster. He then ties Hector's body to a chariot and drags it around the walls of Troy 3 times and rides away unchallenged. Which really does not sound like the magic flight portion of Campbell's model. And killing Hector does not instill Achilles with any kind of power he didn't already possess, nor does it improve his understanding of what it means to be human. Achilles doesn't even get anything like freedom to live that Campbell's model predicts. Instead, he is constantly prophesied to die shortly after the poem ends, and according to other parts of the epic cycle, that's exactly what happens. So, there's no belly of the whale. No ultimate boon, no atonement with the Father, no enlightenment, no magic flight, no freedom to live. If you torture the Iliad enough, you could maybe get it to confess to Achilles receiving supernatural aid because his mom is a nymph, and Athena kind of backs his play. But that would require you to conclude that sitting in his tent and pouting like a soy boy for most of the story counts as an epic quest. The truth is that the Iliad is mostly a story about how Achilles' refusal to fight impacts all of the other characters, and none of those other characters have heroes' journeys either. Honestly, the Iliad is kind of a hot mess. The ancient Greeks were kind of a hot mess.
When I was your age, I was a hot mess.
And by the way, if you got the impression from this short summary that Achilles was kind of a dick, then you've hit upon another major flaw in Campbell's hypothesis. The hero's journey assumes that the hero is essentially good, but that is a much later notion. In ancient Greek myth and many other ancient mythic cycles, heroes were not paragons of morality. They hurt people all the time. Lots of people. Lots of innocent people. On purpose. At one point in the Iliad, Achilles prays for his own people to die, just so his wounded pride over Agamemnon stealing his sex slave can be soothed. And this is one of the reasons that his own bestie Patroclus gets killed. In other myths, Heracles goes mad and slaughters his own family, forcing him to take up his famous 12 labors as punishment. Odysseus returns home from his famous journey to murder 108 of his own people and hang all of the slave women in his household. The great girl boss of Greek myth, Atalanta, holds a contest for her hand in marriage in which she kills each of the losers.
To death! By Snoo Snoo!
Yeah!
What are you, gay?
In the ancient world, characters were considered heroic not because they made great self-sacrifices for the good of the community or served as models of great morality. They were elevated for being young, beautiful, and dangerous, not virtuous. Their only relation to morality was that sometimes their narratives used them as moral warnings to the audience about the dangers of hubris. Joseph Campbell's whole thing about the hero being someone who goes through trials only to return with new knowledge to help his community is premised on a conception of heroism that just isn't found in the myths he marshals for his one myth to rule them all. Campbell cooked up his hypothesis as a function of his own modern conceptions of masculinity and heroism, then infused it with his own highly individualist moral philosophy, and this led him to ignore the actual narrative structures and cultural contexts of the myths he marshaled for his grand story. These sins of contextual omission allowed Campbell to weave an attractive narrative that found particular favor with his white mid-century audience. Echoing the ethical egoism of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, published only a few years earlier, Campbell sold the public on a vision of the individual hero unfettered from community or history. He gave a post-war readership a seemingly timeless archetype for America's unique brand of rugged individualism. He also helped to create a niche for the intersection of pop culture and pop psychology, paving the way for less savory exploitations of narrative by people like Jordan Peterson. Peterson has latched onto Campbell's use of archetypes and gender roles and interprets them as the means for saving humanity from political polarization. And that's the real problem with the hero's journey. A lot of political ideologues use it to sell people not just a story, but an agenda that's pretty damn regressive. Rather than tapping into deep universal truths about human nature, the hero's journey is the product of a particular man's vision, shaped by his particular cultural and historical context, and his particular ideological views. And it shouldn't escape anyone's suspicions that a story structure centering a masculine-coded loner who changes the world through violence, conflict, and willpower became popular within a corporate culture full of mostly men who see themselves as maverick auteurs, precisely because it flatters their self-perceptions. As just one among many story structures, the hero's journey is fine on its own. As we've seen, it can be used to tell interesting, engaging, and moving stories that often resonate with lots of people. But despite its dominance as a template in Hollywood for the past 50-something years, and despite the universalist claims that its advocates make for it, the hero's journey is far from the only valid way to structure a good story. The continued growth and expansion of interactive and streaming platforms doesn't have to trap studios in an endless sea of increasingly formulaic hero's journey slop. There is opportunity here to experiment and explore, to try out other templates for building stories, some newer than the hero's journey, some of about the same age, and some that actually are as ancient as Campbell's pretends to be. And we are beginning to see some early examples of all three of those options happening. For instance, there is the heroine's journey, formulated by a former Campbell student named Maureen Murdoch after Campbell told her that women don't get to be heroes because they are the hero's prize. The heroine's journey explores what happens after the heroes, when it's realized that the hero has simply returned from their adventure to reinforce the status quo. This template, the heroine's journey, was used to build the narrative of the first Hunger Games movie series. The first movie was a hero's journey for Katniss Everdeen, and the rest of the films follow her on the heroine's journey of gathering allies to create real change in the unjust hierarchy of Panem. The 2022 Hulu Predator prequel Prey also draws heavily on the heroine's journey model, especially the stage called Integration of the Masculine and Feminine. The film's protagonist, Naru, is only able to win after she synthesizes the feminine healing skills she learned from her mother with the masculine hunting and tracking skills she taught herself. When she discovers that the orange herb that cools a patient's blood makes her invisible to the predator, Naru is able to complete her heroine's journey by using both medicine and war to achieve victory. Another popular story model, especially in Eastern Asia, is Kisho Tenketsu, a 4-act structure that isn't necessarily driven by conflict or character trauma, or based around tension and resolution. Instead, it is primarily concerned with exploring the hidden relationships between story elements, then presenting those relationships with a catalyst that impacts them and explores how they integrate this new element into a new stasis. The structure is also not symmetrical when it's outlined in graph form. The first act of a Kisho Tenketsu story introduces the audience to the characters and setting, as any other story would do. The second act explores the characters' relationships to each other and the setting more broadly and deeply, and often nothing significant happens. It's really just more of a slice-of-life story that enables the audience to develop emotional connections with the characters. Then, in the third act, a new story element is introduced whose impact cascades across all of the other story elements. This new element isn't necessarily a plot twist as we in the West think of it, but it is related in some way to what happened in Acts 1 and 2. Finally, the fourth act is about the impact of the third act on the first two and how they all become reconciled into a new normal. These kinds of stories are often not about following a single protagonist through a significant change in their character, as the hero's journey is, but instead with how they and their relationships react to a change in their world while remaining basically the same people they were at the story's beginning. Kisho Tenketsu is the most common and popular story structure in media from China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other parts of Eastern Asia. You can see it at work in films as varied in tone and genre as the cozy fantasy of Hayao Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro to the black comedy thriller Parasite by Bong Joon-ho. Films that are often widely misunderstood by Western audiences and critics weaned on generations of conflict-driven hero's journey stories and who don't quite know what to do when they don't get one. Kisho Tenketsu stories are often described by Westerners as stories where nothing happens, or where there is no satisfying resolution to the, from their point of view, sudden and random new elements of the third act. And a lot of the confusion goes in the other direction, too. Asian audiences raised on generations of Kisho Tenketsu-style stories sometimes don't take to Western hero tales as well as Hollywood studios would like them to. Just look at how hard Disney and other studios have been struggling to penetrate the Chinese market by simply casting actors of Chinese descent in standard Western narratives built around the hero's journey. I'm looking at you, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, or Mulan, both of them, or really any Star Wars.
I don't think enough Western filmmakers have spent the time to really analyze the Asian market. That's why you'll notice a lot of American films don't work over here. Chinese audiences didn't grow up with Star Wars culture, so unfortunately it didn't work.
It turns out that story tastes, along with the moral and philosophical ideas that inform them, are culturally determined and historically contingent, not born from a single universal template as Campbell claimed. Audiences weaned on a particular form of storytelling and its accompanying moral universe often have trouble relating to or understanding story styles and character archetypes from cultures other than their own. This is true even when the other culture is one from their own history. The past, as L.P. Hartley reminded us, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So when modern storytellers try to revive an ancient story structure from their own cultural past in a piece of modern media, modern audiences and critics sometimes fail to understand what they are watching. That, too, is thanks to the modern expectation for hero's journey narratives clouding their vision. And there is no better example of this than the show that is currently the most interesting fantasy TV series streaming anywhere in the world. Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I said what I said. One of the most frustrating things about being a Tolkien fan who loves The Rings of Power is encountering smack talk masquerading as critique from people who clearly approached the show in bad faith. It's one thing to have watched the show from a place of honest engagement and still come away not liking it. Plenty of Tolkien fans have done that. Though, oddly, most of them whom I know still recognize that the showrunners have great affection for Tolkien and know the Middle-earth lore quite deeply, despite these fans' unhappiness with the final product. It's quite another thing, however, to come into the show thinking you're smarter than the showrunners without having even a Lambus breadcrumbs worth of credentials to back up your smack talk. And, on top of that, to think that you have ferreted out the showrunner's secret agenda to fix Tolkien, or unravel Western civilization, or whatever. This latter attitude is frustrating not just because of its arrogance and condescension, but also because it often deprives its purveyors of the ability to understand what the show is doing at the level of its narrative construction, even when they notice it happening. This attitude gives them eyes with which they cannot see.
I just realized the whole Dutch angle thing is they did this the last time these two characters spoke to each other. That entire scene was the same thing. That's probably why they're doing it again.
There's so much unease between these characters, you see. This is filmmaking.
I can't believe that they're like, yeah, poetry. Sauron got seasoned, and then Adar got seasoned. Rhymes.
And
both of them, their failure
rhymes
so much as the well-being of the orcs.
I mean, like,
Okay.
I guess a word does rhyme with itself, technically.
I just find it funny because it's just like, it doesn't matter how we get there. That's all that is reflected in this as a payoff, right? We don't care how we get there, just as long as we get there. And getting there and having it be the same as what happened at the beginning, that makes it good.
Yeah, you can tell they
on writing.
When they were writing season 2, they clearly designed the first scene to have an inversion at the end. And then I guess they decided to try and connect the dots and just didn't really.
I detour into this silly take on the show for 2 reasons. First, because this is the kind of fake critique that dominates discourse around the show on YouTube, and this framing has significantly poisoned the well of all other discussion. And second, because these particular clips come so close to actually understanding how the show works and then fumble the ball because of their own narcissism and arrogance. What they noticed and then dismissed because they think they're big boy smarty pants is that the Rings of Power is not relying on standard linear narratives built around heroes' journeys. Instead, it employs a much older story structure that relies on parallels, reflections, and mirroring to convey narrative information at every level of its construction, and comprising 2 symmetrical halves with the conclusion returning to a new version of the beginning. And understanding how this ancient story structure works is the key to deciphering most of the things about the show that even its good faith critics find mysterious or confusing. Rings of Power is using a story template called chiastic structure, or ring composition. Despite the pun in its name, ring composition is actually a very old method of building stories. It's the one used in ancient heroic poems like Beowulf, the Iliad, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Chiastic structure is the closest thing to what Campbell's hero's journey claims to be, a near-universal template in the ancient Western world for building an engaging story. It takes its name from its shape, which resembles the Greek letter chi, which looks to us like the letter X. But it's not the letter X.
It's not an S.
A visual representation of a chiastic story shows its narrative elements converging on a central hinge point and then being reflected or paralleled in reverse order as they fan out from the central hinge point. So a chiastic story would go narrative element A, followed by narrative element B, followed by narrative element C. Then, after crossing the hinge point, it would go narrative element C prime, followed by B prime, followed by A prime, the end, with each of the primes being a reflection or a parallel of their counterparts in the first half of the story. The hinge point isn't necessarily the climax of a chiastic story. In fact, it usually isn't. That still comes towards the end, like in most stories. But the hinge is the point at which the whole narrative abruptly shifts in some way. Characters reverse major decisions, or the tone changes, or the pacing accelerates, or any number of other things. The longer the story, the more elements there are, the more complex the chiasmus gets as all the elements interact and become multiple reflections of each other, as they become rings within rings. When you map out the elements of a chiastic story as a bullet point outline, it often takes on a wedge shape that suggests one half of the letter chi. It's sometimes also called ring structure because to the audience the story can feel circular thanks to all of the reflections and returnings. Chiastic structure isn't only found in ancient literature, though. It's still employed in many modern works. Notably, J.R.R. Tolkien used the structure in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A chiastic outline of each of those stories should be on screen right now. You can pause the video to read them, or follow the links in the description to read more detailed analyses of each. Now, in what may be the best and most subtle of its many homages to Tolkien, The Rings of Power is employing chiastic structures at every level of its narrative construction too. Plot, character development, theme, lighting, cinematography, score, editing, basically everything. And this is not speculation on my part. The showrunners, Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, publicly confirmed their use of chiasmus in an interview for the official Rings of Power podcast.
Quickly, the other thing I was going to say about that, the show starts with her brother saying, "Be careful of false light in the water." Hopefully it's also rhyming back to some of the imagery he warned her about.
And something that you'll see a lot of in the show is this sort of chiastic structuring within seasons, across seasons, within scenes, within episodes, where you have this sort of rhyme or symmetry, sort of a ring structure, where something you see in the beginning is then mirrored again at the end.
McKay and Payne have famously said that they already know what the final shot of the final episode of the final season will be. It will likely be some variation on the first shots of the first episode of the first season. And it's the chiastic structuring of the show that enables them to know this that far out from the final season. I genuinely believe that a lot of good faith critics of the show, who are more used to and therefore expecting strictly linear storytelling rising to a final crisis with a denouement built around a standard hero's journey template for its protagonists, are kind of thrown off by the show's actual structure. But once you understand how the Rings of Power is built and what it is doing, a lot of elements that critics called out as unnecessarily mysterious, vague, or unfinished begin to make sense. Through an interwoven network of repeated narrative elements, phrases, symbols, musical progressions, camera angles, etc., that some dismiss as cheap fan service, The Rings of Power is actually building narrative cohesion across its planned 5 seasons, and reading it in its intended circular structure reveals that elements that currently feel random, disconnected, or out of place are actually ones that have just not yet received their reflection or parallel, because the show's larger plot has not yet crossed its hinge point. That will likely come midway through the show's currently filming 3rd season, after which these earlier elements will begin to receive their reflections and their larger narrative purpose will come into view. There are a lot of examples I could draw from the show's text to demonstrate all of this, but I'll focus on the one that really seems to piss everybody off: the portrayals of Galadriel and Sauron. Galadriel's and Sauron's character arcs across the first 2 seasons of The Rings of Power reflect each other in a large narrative ring that's grounded in 4 elements of their backstories from Tolkien's Legendarium. Number 1, the fact that Sauron briefly but sincerely sought redemption in the Second Age, as attested in The Silmarillion and Tolkien's Letter 131. Number 2, Galadriel not noticing that her mind had been touched by the shadow, just like the rest of the Noldor, as we are told in the Shibboleth of Feanor. Number 3, the revelation in the Fellowship of the Ring that Galadriel knows the Dark Lord's mind, or all of it that concerns the elves, and that Sauron gropes ever to know hers. And number 4, the statement in the Unfinished Tales that Sauron immediately perceived that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and tried to placate her, bearing her scorn with outward patience and courtesy. Taken together, these 4 elements suggest a direct personal connection between Galadriel and Sauron at some point in their long histories, and the show uses plausible dramatic license to explore that connection. Galadriel's arc is from light into darkness, and back into light. Sauron's arc is from darkness into light, and back into darkness. This seemed rather obvious to me as I watched the show. I mean, this shot alone should have tipped people off, but as I witnessed the discourse around it during the first season, it became clear to me that a lot of people were perhaps not paying as much attention to the non-dialogue and non-action elements of the show as I assumed they would. Just paying attention to how each character is lit across both seasons, especially in their scenes together, conveys the narrative information that Galadriel begins in light, descends into darkness, and rises back into light, and vice versa for Sauron, who begins his arc usually in shadow, then rises fully into light at Season 1's hinge point, and slowly descends back into shadow across the rest of that season. Speaking of hinge points, Season 1's happens when the white tree Nimloth sheds its leaves, a sign of divine providence that causes Queen Regent Tarmiriel to change her mind about Galadriel. At this moment, and the episode that follows, Galadriel is fully in shadow, and Sauron is fully in light. And yet, each of them still bears a touch of their opposite within them. After this hinge point, we begin to see numerous reflections in the second half of the season of elements from the first half of the season. The most obvious one is that towards the beginning of episode 1, we see young Galadriel gazing upon all she is fated to lose in Valinor, while Finrod rises into the light of the two trees. This is mirrored by the final scene of episode 8, with Sauron gazing upon all he is fated to claim in Mordor, and then descends into the shadows of Mount Doom's eruptions. The two sequences are almost exact copies of each other in terms of camera angles, editing, and timing, and they convey important narrative information. They're not just there because the showrunners thought it would be clever. Galadriel's relationship to his shadow is also mirrored in reverse order on both halves of the Season 1 hinge. In Episode 1, just after the shot mentioned above, Galadriel breaks through a wall of ice in Forodwaith, opening a door that invites darkness to thrive within her. In Episode 8, just before the shots of Sauron mentioned above, she closes a door in an act of redemptive sacrifice that allows the light of humility to begin growing within her. So the sequence goes: narrative element A, Galadriel gazing upon the light; narrative element B, Galadriel opening a door to darkness; the mid-season hinge point, Nimloth shedding its leaves; narrative element B prime, Galadriel closing a door on darkness; and narrative element A prime, Sauron gazing upon the shadow. A neat, tidy little chiastic structure. The point of all of this is that both Galadriel and Sauron come full circle with new insight and choose their fates with full agency. Sauron is truly good at the zenith of his arc in Numenor. Galadriel is truly fallen at the nadir of her arc at the same point in the story. Because each of them still holds a seed of their origin within, they each have a path back to their beginning, but only if they choose it. And by the way, that's the only point of the much maligned "you must touch the darkness to know the light" line from Finrod. All that meant was that sometimes your faith and discernment must be tested for you to truly learn who you are. Sauron has a similar conversation in his Season 2 flashback. Diarmid tells Sauron that he has to keep choosing good if he wants to actually be good. Same message that Galadriel got from Finrod, but Sauron takes it in the opposite direction. It's not just Galadriel and Sauron the show does this with either. The Rings of Power is full of parallels and reflections like this. Elrond and Gil-galad trade the line, "Hope is never mere, even when it is meager." Harfoots use a bird call to signal safety in an act of self-preservation on one side of the Season 1 hinge. Then Harfoots use a bird call to invite danger in an act of self-sacrifice on the other side, and so on. I could go on for hours, but this video is already too damn long, and you should just go watch The Rings of Power on your own. Maybe using this knowledge of its chiastic structure at work will help you appreciate it as much as I do, or at least maybe help you understand elements of the show that you previously thought were too vague or too random. Whew, that was a lot. Maybe I'll do a shorter video next time. So, to wrap all of this up, please don't leave this video thinking that I think the hero's journey is a giant piece of crap. As I said earlier, It is a valid tool for building a specific style of story that's particular to modern American sensibilities. But it's important to remember the modern American sensibilities part of that observation. In your sojourns across YouTube searching for boons of media literacy, you will encounter many strange beings claiming that the hero's journey provides insight into some deep and ancient wisdom about human gender roles or natural hierarchies. They are only trying to distract you, though. The true wisdom is that the only intrinsic human trait is adaptability, and the diversity of ways that we construct stories and envision heroes across time and culture is the magical fruit of that trait. Take it home with you and share it. Thanks for watching. Before you go, please be sure to make all the proper sacrifices of likes, shares, subs, and comments to the great god algorithm. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.